Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. We live in an age where reason itself has come under suspicion, where we suspect that theories are the result of motivated reasoning or ideology. Friedrich Nietzsche is famous for claiming in 1886 that all philosophy hitherto had been the unconscious memoir of the philosophers, with prejudices justified by reasons sought after the fact. To Nietzsche, the most important question to ask about his predecessors was what morality they were attempting to establish. But 9 years before him on another continent, the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce started publishing articles in science magazines that would influence the way we think about the relationship between thought and action. His 1877 work, The Fixation of Belief, examines how we come to believe as we do through a psychology of inference. However, unlike Nietzsche and later postmodernists, Peirce tackles the issue without making self-contradictory claims of it being objectively true, that there is no objective truth. Peirce starts off by saying that most of us never study logic, but nevertheless have some self-confidence when it comes to reasoning. According to him, everyone seems to believe he is adept at reasoning, but it is an art that we come to last and not a gift of nature. We are not perfectly logical creatures by nature, but we do develop habits of mind that have us draw one inference rather than another. It is as if we have some impulse toward it, but even without that impulse, a true conclusion would still be true. The object of reasoning is to go from what we already know to what is currently unknown. In logic, the question of validity is a question of fact, as to whether the assumptions or premises imply the truth of the conclusion which we draw. The habit of mind that we use may be considered a good one if it allows us to avoid drawing a false conclusion from true premises. It is not really a question of whether we feel an impulse, although we generally do reason correctly. The habit of mind that governs this or that inference, Peirce calls a guiding principle. It can be formulated in a proposition whose truth depends upon the validity of the inferences determined by the habit. Despite all his references to logic, Peirce actually has in mind a broad array of what he calls guiding principles, going beyond what would be explained in a logic textbook. His example of a guiding principle of inference is to suppose that we observe that a rotating disk of copper quickly comes to rest when placed between the poles of a magnet, and we infer that this will happen with every disk of copper. The guiding principle is that what is true of one piece of copper is true of another. So to clear up any confusion that may be created by the talk about logic, Peirce really means inferences in general, in all fields. And this is why he says in section 1 that each chief step in science has been a lesson in logic, and that it exposes a defective state in the art of reasoning that was visible in previous theories that it may revise or replace. He tells us that a whole book can be written to catalog the most important guiding principles, but it would not be useful to most people who direct their attention to practical subjects. Most of us will be concerned with the guiding principles of our own academic fields, businesses, or occupations. If we venture into an unfamiliar field, we can become like a ship on the open sea without a competent navigator. So to limit the discussion, Peirce will focus on a limited number of facts, because almost any fact can serve as a guiding principle. He divides facts into two kinds: those that are essential as guiding principles, and those that have some other interest as objects of research. The facts that are guiding principles aren't necessarily taken for granted in asking whether the conclusion follows from the premises. A variety of facts are assumed when the logical question is first asked. These logical question facts will serve his purpose in his essay of determining and evaluating the methods of fixing belief. And the facts he uses as guiding principles are explained in section 2 of the essay that I have in this anthology, where he says, it is implied, for instance, that there are such states of mind as doubt and belief, that a passage from one to the other is possible, the object of thought remaining the same, and that this transition is subject to some rules which all minds are alike bound by. As these are facts which we must already know before we can have any clear conception of reasoning at all, it cannot be supposed to be any longer of much interest to inquire into their truth or falsity. Now recall that the good guiding principles are those that do not lead us to draw false conclusions from true premises in an inference. What Peirce will look to establish for evaluating methods of fixing belief is to examine whether a proposed method might be a bad one, if it leads us into a state of doubt as to whether we may be drawing false conclusions from true premises. Before going directly into this, however, a short examination of the nature of doubt and its relation to inquiry will be necessary. Peirce identifies three differences between belief and doubt. The first is that we know when we want to ask a question and when we want to pronounce a judgment. The second is that our beliefs guide our desires and shape our actions. When in doubt, we often do not act as we do when believing. The third and important difference here is that doubt, according to him, is an uneasy and dissatisfied state from which we struggle to free ourselves and pass into a state of belief. Once we have a belief, we generally cling to it in a calm and satisfactory state that we prefer not to end. Both doubt and belief have effects on action. Belief will not make us act at once, but will put us into a condition to behave in a certain way when the occasion arises. Doubt stimulates us to destroy it. The struggle to move from doubt to belief is what Peirce calls inquiry. The sole object of inquiry is to attain a state of belief, but not necessarily to arrive at a true opinion. Peirce's argument for this is that the irritation of doubt is the only immediate motive to struggle for belief. It is also best that our beliefs be fit to guide our actions and satisfy our desires, leading us to reject any proposed belief that does not assure this result. It is only when there is genuine doubt that a struggle will begin. He says the fancy that we require a true belief specifically, when put to the test, shows that as soon as a firm belief is reached, we are satisfied. The real requirement is only that we think a belief to be true, which is the same thing as believing it. The proposition that the settlement of opinions is the sole object of inquiry has philosophical importance, according to Peirce, because he says it sweeps away various vague and erroneous conceptions of proof. He disputes that in order to start an inquiry, it is only necessary to pose a question. Instead, there must be a real living doubt to stimulate the mind to struggle after belief. Secondly, he disputes that demonstrations must ultimately rest upon some unquestionable first principles or first sensations. We need only start with propositions free from actual doubts. The paradigm example, but not the only one of the kind of thinking Peirce is disputing here, is René Descartes' famous method of doubt. Descartes proposed in his Meditations on First Philosophy to doubt all that is not clearly and distinctly true in order to place metaphysics and the sciences upon a firm foundation. A more important point that Peirce makes, thirdly, is that it is useless to continue to argue a point after all are convinced. It is futile because when doubt ceases, all mental effort on that subject also ceases. And so inquiry being used only to settle opinions will give us a needed narrowing of focus. This consideration also allows Peirce to segue into his four methods of fixing belief. The first method seems to be suggested by the facts that the settlement of opinion is alone the goal of inquiry, and that belief is of the nature of a habit. We could therefore just take any answer that we fancy as our belief, and have contempt for anything that might disturb it. This is the method of tenacity. It is the method of many who have a dislike of the undecided. It involves keeping out of view what might change the opinion. Peirce gives the example of a man suggesting to him that he avoid reading a certain newspaper because it may lead him to changing his opinion on free trade. The ostrich with his head in the sand is taking the happiest course. The nature of religion is like this, because faith brings a certain peace of mind. Those who believe they will immediately go to heaven after death have a pleasure that will not be followed by disappointment if, in reality, death is the immediate annihilation of anything we call consciousness or soul. Peirce says that this method in practice will be unable to hold its ground. There is a social impulse against it, and the man who adopts it will find other men believing differently. If we are not to be hermits, we must influence each other. It is important to see that another person's thoughts or sentiments may be equivalent in value to one's own. And this leads to a shaking of confidence in the belief adopted by this method. To relate this to what was said before, this leads to the reintroduction of doubt, and thus a possibility that from a bad guiding principle we may be led to false conclusions, and thus inquiry reintroduces itself. One potential idea for resolving this problem with the tenacity method is to eliminate the phenomenon of different people holding different opinions by having the state intervene to enforce an orthodoxy. This is the method of authority, which is to solve the problem of how to fix belief in the community. An institution can be created to keep correct doctrines before the attention of the people and keep them ignorant of anything that might lead them to think differently. We must also enlist their passions so that they regard unusual opinions with hate and horror. And Peirce goes on saying in section 5 of his essay, he says, "Then let all men who reject the established belief be terrified into silence. Let the people turn out and tar and feather such men. Or let inquisitions be made into the manner of thinking of suspected persons. And, when they are found guilty of forbidden beliefs, let them be subjected to some signal punishment. When complete agreement could not otherwise be reached, a general massacre of all who have not thought in a certain way has proved a very effective means of settling opinion in a country." This method has been used successfully to uphold the universal or Catholic character of theological and political doctrines. Peirce cites ancient Rome as the most perfect example in history. Wherever there is a priesthood, this method will more or less be used. It may also be present where there is some aristocracy, a guild, or an association of a class of men who have an interest that depends upon certain propositions. Cruelties will always accompany this system, and when it is implemented most consistently, it creates what Peirce says is atrocities of the most horrible kind in the eyes of any rational man. As a matter of interpretation, I think Peirce has it in mind to put under the category of the method of authority controls of varying levels of cruelty, which may include only ostracizing or removing someone from a church or occupational position. In evaluating the method of authority, we can say that in a certain sense it does have a mental and moral superiority over the method of tenacity. It works better, and the statues it has put up in Thailand, Egypt, and Europe are a testament to it. The lifetime of it is often so vast that it would change so slowly during one person's lifetime that individual belief remains fixed. Peirce says that it also appeals to the masses of humanity whose highest impulse is to be intellectual slaves. For most of us, there is no better method. Of course, most people using this method, who we now call non-player characters, will deny this and insist that they are independent thinkers because they believe what they have permission to believe. If you think of yourself as an independent thinker because you repeat what you are told rather than being one of those conspiracy theorists or those Neanderthals over there, your method of fixing belief is the method of authority. One problem that it does share with tenacity is that some men may see that other men in other places and times have beliefs that are different. From this, they can infer that their belief system is merely a contingent and historical accident of what they were taught. Doubt can then arise upon reflection that there is no rational reason to rate these views at a higher value than those of another culture. I think this makes sense in terms of using the decline of religious sentiment as an example. Compared to our ancestors, we know more about other religions and see that the Muslim, the Hindu, the Buddhist all come to believe what they were taught without critical reflection. Given this, we can infer that the cause of this or that religious belief in the vast majority of individuals, including ourselves, must be the ovarian lottery. Peirce also tells us it is true that no institution can control everything and regulate opinions on every subject. They will not always know what to censor, or find it in time before some men put two and two together. Eventually, people will come to doubt every belief that has been determined by caprice and decide that the willful adherence to a belief and arbitrarily forcing it upon others must be abandoned. As for what may be done in the meantime under that system, I will recommend an 80-page piece called The Power of the Powerless from 1978 by Václav Havel, who would later become the president of the Czech Republic after he peacefully split up the former Czechoslovakia. It was originally written and distributed while living under the yoke of a communist dictatorship. Havel agrees with Peirce that the state cannot in perpetuity eliminate all expressions of nonconformity, and among other things he asks, what happens if one day that vegetable seller does not put out his little sign that says, "Workers of the world unite"? The potential alternative to the authority method would be to let our natural preferences go unimpeded and let men freely converse under their influence in their different lights. This leads us to the a priori method, under which we gradually develop beliefs in harmony with their natural causes within us. It is what we are inclined to believe. The most perfect example is the history of metaphysics, which does not rest on observed facts, but instead seeks fundamental propositions that are agreeable to reason. The shock of opinions will lead men to rest their preferences on a universal nature. This is more intellectual and reasonable from the point of view of reason than the other methods. However, according to Peirce, it will be based on sentiments that have accidental causes. Even without government force, the a priori method makes of inquiry something similar to the development of tastes and fashions of one's time and place. Instead of metaphysicians coming to a fixed agreement, we have a pendulum always swinging between a more material and a more spiritual philosophy. Though it promises to deliver us from capricious and accidental elements, it magnifies other causal circumstances, often of sentiment. To satisfy our doubts, we must find a method by which our beliefs are caused by nothing human, resting instead on some external permanency. It must be something that can and does affect every man equally, so that the conclusion of every man will be the same. And because it must affect us all the same, our method cannot rest on the inspiration of mystics who claim that they have received something from on high. That is just the method of tenacity. Instead, what Peirce has in mind is the scientific method, which, when done properly and honestly, should yield the same results for all. He admits that science itself has its own assumptions, but they are easily knowable to all and reasonable in the judgment of rational men. He says the fundamental hypothesis of the scientific method is: there are real things whose characters are entirely independent of our opinions about them. Those realities affect our senses according to regular laws, and though our sensations are as different as our relations to the object, yet, by taking advantage of the laws of perception, we can ascertain by reasoning how things really are. And any man, if he have sufficient experience and reason enough about it, will be led to the one true conclusion. The new conception here involved is that of reality. Now, this talk about realities affecting our senses certainly looks like a mouthful of metaphysics that can only be determined by the a priori method. But Peirce will make an argument that it is reasonable to accept it. If anyone should ask how we know about these realities, he says he has 4 points to make. The first is that the application of the method does not lead to the contrary conclusion that the realities do not exist. The concept and method are at least in harmony, even if the method itself is not proof of the realities on which it is based. Secondly, the feeling of doubt between two incompatible propositions is a concession, however vague, that there is some one thing to which a proposition must conform. Therefore, nobody doubts these realities. The third point is that everyone uses the scientific method about many things, even when unaware of it or not educated in it. The last point is that experience with the method does not lead us to doubt it. Compared to the other three methods, the scientific is the only one that presents a distinction between a right and wrong way to apply it. Under the other methods, what counts is only what I am inclined to think under the a priori method, what I decide under tenacity, and what the unaccountable state requires under authority, where it becomes right because the state requires it, not the other way around. In science, we start with the known and proceed to the unknown by way of observed facts. The rules are not approved by the investigation. Good and bad reasoning are still both possible, but the test of whether the method is followed properly is in its application. Good or bad science is in the good or bad application of the method, rather than in the personal inclinations of the scientist, or in what a government or corporation would prefer him to conclude. I would add to Peirce's explanation an important point in this context, that the state of current scientific research is something that can be verified. The real science is the result of experiments that are peer-reviewed and published in a journal, which can then be further tested in attempts to replicate it. These articles are expected to be detailed in their explanation of the data collected and methodology. The rational expectation is for the study to be cited for you to know where to find it. As a result, we need not use the method of authority when faced with talking heads or politicians who tell us to listen to what they say is the science and whom they call the experts. In a debate, the guy citing the research uses the method of science, and the guy hurling accusations is using the method of authority. In his concluding remarks, Peirce admits that the other three methods have some advantage over the scientific method. He likes the method of tenacity for its simplicity, and the fact that we have a hard time not admiring men who are decisive and don't waste time. The a priori method is flattering to our vanity, with facts not interfering with our pleasant dreams. As for the authority method, he wants to add to its success in settling opinion the idea that it is a method of peace. Maybe it is peaceful for the conformist, but I would otherwise dispute this. Earlier in this same article, Peirce himself says cruelties always accompany this system. Yet, should someone still not be convinced to adopt Peirce's preference for the scientific method, he says, then he should consider that, after all, he wishes his opinions to coincide with the facts, and that there is no reason why the results of those first three methods should do so. To say that adopting the scientific method of fixing belief may come at a cost is part of what Peirce argues to be its value. That makes it in some sense more noble to choose it as one of the ruling decisions of our lives. He says that a clear logical conscience does cost something, just as all that we cherish costs us dear, but we should not desire it to be otherwise. The reason he says this is that what is more wholesome than any particular belief is integrity of belief, and that to avoid looking into the support of any belief from a fear that it may turn out rotten is quite as immoral as it is disadvantageous. He says our method should be loved and accepted as a bride that a man has chosen to the exclusion of all the world, and from whom he will tolerate some grief without complaining, and strive to be a worthy knight and champion of her. It is somewhat fitting, I think, that Peirce ends his paper with some sentimental appeal like this, because he wishes to acknowledge the strengths of the other methods that he rejects. So for him, it does make sense to draw the analogy with a man choosing a bride while still acknowledging that she is not the only nice or pretty girl out there. That being said, it is good that Peirce has communicated a position that sometimes it can prove sufficiently disadvantageous to choose the wrong method that it can raise the question of its morality. To my thinking, the true value, not just of actual science, but also of scientific thinking, shows itself when it tells us something that we might prefer to not be true. Facts and values are different, such that what we would want to be true may be different from what is true. Would it be nicer if Czech and Slovakian people can share a country without conflict, without either group ever feeling that the other is imposing their own preference? Sure, I think it would be nicer if that were true, but is it true? I'm talking here about people in large enough numbers that they can form parallel societies with their own cultural ethos, be who they really are, and chafe if something that seems foreign to them is imposed on them by the other group. Separatist sentiments can then emerge among the Scottish in the UK, Sikhs in India, the Quebec French in Canada, and the Malays creating Singapore by kicking out the Chinese. Now, I'm no expert on the Czechoslovakia situation. It was Václav Havel who had to deal with the question of Czechs and Slovaks, and it resulted in a peaceful separation known as the Velvet Divorce. By contrast, the violent separation of the former Yugoslavia may be something that gets repeated, whether we want it or not. Choosing ideology over reality and imposing the consequences on your fellow citizens is, in what is in Peirce's terms, quite as immoral as it is disadvantageous. I have hinted at it before that Peirce is evaluating the scientific method by the a priori method that he criticizes, I think unfairly. The a priori refers to what is beyond sense experience to demonstrate, and a proposition being true a priori means it being known prior to an object being given in experience. Peirce at times makes it sound more like a subjectivism, that he does not differentiate from tenacity. Science can only determine a fact to the extent that it is empirically verifiable. It cannot determine questions of value or matters of metaphysical speculation about ultimate realities. This includes the realities, his term, of objects affecting the senses that he says is assumed in the sciences. I would take the position that what science actually tells us about is regularities in perception, without judging the nature of what may or may not exist outside of perception. As a result, we are in fact stuck with the a priori method of determining some matters of what to believe. I would also argue in its defense that with logical restrictions on belief that could be called rational, for instance, that we should not create internal contradictions or deny what we already know from sense experience, means that this method does not allow us to play fast and loose with our theories. Therefore, I submit that the scientific method is not the only one that admits of a right and wrong way of applying it. As for Peirce's praise for the authority method for its power to fix belief, I will draw a distinction between fixing belief and silencing dissent. A dictator is limited in his power to fix belief by cultural factors of what people might already consider rational or too insane to consider. If someone were to overthrow my government and install himself as dictator, he could say all he wants that those who believe that the earth is round and those who believe it to be flat are both idiots, because obviously the earth is shaped like a cube. He could silence dissent, yes, but who is actually going to think it to be true that the earth is a cube? Peirce has taken the position that inquiry itself is the product of a kind of doubt, which he says is an uneasy and dissatisfied state from which we struggle to free ourselves and pass into the state of belief. I will suggest instead that there may be many ideas which many men would say that they doubt, but are indifferent toward having any inquiry about them. Sometimes we just don't care and don't need to decide an issue. His successor, William James, has argued instead, although not for the purpose of responding to Peirce, that there is a limited number of situations in which we have any need to decide to believe this theory or its opposite. Some issues are just not live for us, not forcing us to choose, and come with no price for getting it wrong. All this being said, my critical comments, if valid, would suggest a revision mostly to the presentation of what Peirce argues. I generally do accept his thesis that the scientific method of fixing belief is the preferable alternative, at least where it is available. His psychology of inference seems to match my experience that many of my fellow men do prefer Peirce's methods of authority and tenacity, if only out of intellectual laziness. And that is sufficient to explain why anyone believes what he believes when he is wrong. Therefore, it is reasonable to suspect that other explanations overestimate their cunning or intelligence and are not needed. Well, that's all for now. If you liked it, feel free to check out my other videos, send links to your friends, and thanks for watching.